The morning they told me I wasn't invited, I was wearing my good coat. The camel one, with the brass buttons that my husband Raymond had picked out for me at a little shop in Vermont, the winter before he passed. I'd ironed it the night before, pressed the lapels flat, buffed the buttons until they caught the light. I wanted to look nice. I wanted my son to see me and think, she's doing well, she's still herself. Instead, my daughter-in-law looked at my coat, then at her watch and said, "Dorothy, we need to talk before we load the car." My son was standing by the kitchen counter. He didn't look at me when she said it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where it started, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. It was a Sunday in October when my son called. I remember because I was raking leaves in the backyard, the kind of afternoon that feels like it was designed to make you feel small and grateful at the same time. The maples had gone full gold. The air smelled like wood smoke and wet earth. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, and when I saw his name on the screen, I pulled off my gardening glove to answer it. "Mom," he said, "how are you doing?" We didn't talk often, not really. There were the obligatory calls on birthdays, the brief exchanges at holidays, where my daughter-in-law hovered nearby, and my son chose his words the way a man chooses his steps across a frozen pond, carefully, always with one eye on where he was going, rather than where he'd been. So when he called on a random Sunday afternoon with warmth in his voice, something in me went very still. "I'm well," I said, "just getting the yard together before the cold comes." "You shouldn't be doing that alone," he said. "That's actually part of why I'm calling." He told me they were planning a Christmas trip, a family gathering, he called it, at a lake house in the Adirondacks. His wife's family had rented it before, he said. And it was beautiful, quiet, the kind of place where you could really slow down and be together. "We want you there," he said. "It wouldn't be the same without you." I stood in the backyard, with one glove on and one glove off, and I felt something open up in my chest that I hadn't realized had been closed. "Of course," I said. "I'd love that." He said he'd send me the details. He said it was going to be a good Christmas. He sounded like the boy I raised, the one who used to sit beside me at the kitchen table while I helped him with his homework and ask me questions about everything, the moon and recipes, and whether I thought dogs dreamed. After we hung up, I stood there in the gold afternoon for a long time. I called my sister Ruth that evening. She lives in Tucson and has always been the one person in my life who tells me the truth without making it feel like an accusation. "That's wonderful," she said when I told her. Then, after a pause, "How did Vanessa sound?" Vanessa was my daughter-in-law. She had a way of being perfectly pleasant that somehow always left you feeling like you'd said the wrong thing. "My son called," I said. "Not Vanessa." Said Ruth. I dismissed the sound. I was too busy feeling hopeful to make room for anything else. Over the next 6 weeks, I prepared the way I used to prepare for things that mattered. I ordered a new pair of waterproof boots for the snow. I found a deep green cardigan at the consignment shop on Elm Street that made my eyes look brighter. I baked 2 loaves of cranberry walnut bread, wrapped them carefully, and tucked them in my suitcase. I thought about what it would feel like to sit around a fire with my son on Christmas morning, the way we used to when he was small, and the world was still a place I understood. I let myself want it. That was my mistake, maybe. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe wanting things is just what it means to still be alive. The week before Christmas, my son called again. His voice was different this time. "Mom, I need to let you know about a change of plans." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The cranberry bread was already packed. "What kind of change?" I asked. "Vanessa's sister is coming," he said. "Melissa, and her husband and the kids. We didn't know they could make it, but they're flying in from Portland, and with everyone there, it's going to be a full house." I waited. Something in his tone told me we hadn't arrived at the real sentence yet. "We think it might be better," he said slowly, "if you celebrated here, in town. We'll come see you before the new year, I promise. We'll do a dinner." The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. "You're uninviting me," I said. I didn't say it with anger. I said it the way you identify a fact you'd rather not be true. "It's not like that," he exhaled. "It's just a space issue. And honestly, Mom, Melissa's kids are loud, and I know how you feel about noise, and I just think, your father built that house, I said quietly. This wasn't true of the Adirondack Lake house, of course, but the house inside me, the one he had just walked out of, that one Raymond had built. You used to sleep with the lights on until you were 9 years old because you were afraid of the dark, and I sat with you every single night. Silence. I'll call you Christmas morning, he said finally. I set the phone down on the table. I didn't slam it. I just set it down, the way you set down something fragile that has already broken. Vanessa called 20 minutes later. Her voice was the voice she used when she was being kind, which was somehow worse than the other voice. Dorothy, I just want you to know that this wasn't personal. We adore you, but Melissa and Derek are going through some things right now, and we're trying to be there for them, and it's just a complicated dynamic, you understand. Of course, I said. And if you need anything over the holidays, truly, please don't hesitate. We left a poinsettia on your porch last week. After she hung up, I went to the front door and looked. There was indeed a poinsettia on the porch. Small, red, already losing one of its leaves to the cold. I brought it inside and set it on the windowsill. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen, unwrapped one of the cranberry loaves, and ate 2 slices standing at the counter in the dark. I didn't sleep well that night, or the next. I moved through the house the way you move when a room has lost its purpose, slowly, without clear direction. I reorganized the linen closet. I watched 3 episodes of a British baking show I'd already seen. I called Ruth, and she listened and didn't say I told you so, which is the greatest gift a sister can give. On the 3rd day, I decided to go up to Raymond's study. I hadn't been in there much since he passed. Not because it made me sad, though it did, but because the room still felt like his, like I was a visitor in it. His desk was the same dark walnut it had always been. His reading glasses were still folded on top of a stack of books he never finished. And in the bottom left drawer, underneath a folder of old tax returns and a photograph of us in Cape Cod, there was an envelope he'd asked me to keep. He had given it to me 3 years before he died, during a stretch when we both knew his health was declining and were choosing not to say it out loud. He'd pressed it into my hands one evening after dinner and said, "Don't open this until you need to." And then he'd smiled, in that quiet way he had, the smile that meant he knew something he wasn't ready to explain. "You'll know when," he said. I had put it in his drawer and not thought about it since. I told myself I was respecting his wishes. The truth is, I was afraid of needing it. I took the envelope to the kitchen table and sat down with my tea. Inside was a letter in Raymond's handwriting, which was the careful, deliberate handwriting of a man who had been an engineer and believed that precision extended to everything, including the way you formed your letters. Dorothy, if you're reading this, something has happened that's made the world feel smaller than it should. I know you. I know how you absorb other people's choices as if they're reflections of your own worth. They are not. There's something I should have told you years ago. When my father's business was dissolved after he died, not all of it was sold. The property on Lakeshore Road, the one he called the mill property, was put into a trust under your name. My father did this on purpose. He said you were the most sensible person in the family, and he wasn't wrong. I had the trust maintained quietly because I didn't want it to change anything between us or between you and our son. I didn't want money to become the reason people were kind to you. I wanted them to be kind because you deserved it. The trust is real. The property is real. It's worth considerably more than it was when he transferred it. There is a file in the cabinet behind my desk. The attorney's name is Paul Whitmore. He's been expecting your call for years. This is yours, Dorothy. Not ours. Not his. Yours. Don't let anyone make you small. Raymond. I read the letter 4 times. Each time I came to the last line, I had to stop and breathe. I went to the cabinet behind his desk. The file was exactly where he said it would be. Inside, legal documents, property records, correspondence from Paul Whitmore's office dating back 17 years. All of it clean, all of it in my name. I sat on the floor of Raymond's study in my bathrobe, with the file open in my lap and cried, not from sadness, from something harder to name, the feeling of being held by someone who was no longer there to hold you. I called Paul Whitmore the next morning. He answered before the second ring. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of someone who had been waiting a long time to say a name. "I'm so glad you called. Your husband told me you would, when you were ready." He explained everything with patience and without condescension, which I appreciated. The mill property had been developed over the years into a small commercial complex. It generated income. It had appreciated substantially. He had updated paperwork ready that required only my signature to transfer full operational authority into my name. "What would you like to do with it?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I'd like to understand all of it first." "That's exactly the right answer," he said. We met at his office 2 days before Christmas. I wore the green cardigan and the new boots. I brought the second cranberry loaf, which I left with his receptionist. I sat at a large oak table, and for 3 hours, I listened and asked questions, and signed my name to things that had always been mine. Walking out into the cold afternoon, I felt something shift in me the way ice shifts in early March, quietly, and then all at once. I sat in my car in the parking lot and took out my phone. My son's Christmas trip was at the Whitmore Lake property. Paul had mentioned the name casually, as part of a description of the region. It took me a moment, and then I understood. The lake house they had rented, the one he said Vanessa's family had used before, the one with the wraparound porch and the stone fireplace and the private dock, that property was part of the Lakeshore Road Trust. The house my son had taken his family to for Christmas, instead of me, was my house. I sat with that for a while. Then I called Paul back. "The Whitmore Lake property," I said. "Is it currently occupied?" "Yes, through the rental management company. A family party, I believe, through January 2nd. "I see," I said. "I don't want to cancel the booking, but I'd like the property manager to make one small update to the guest welcome materials, the standard letter that goes out on arrival. I'd like my name added as the property owner. Just a line. Nothing more." Paul was quiet for a moment. "I can arrange that," he said. "The manager typically sends a courtesy note on Christmas Eve." "Perfect," I said. "That's all." Christmas Eve. I didn't sit at home waiting. I called Ruth and told her everything. There was a long silence on her end, and then she started laughing. Not unkindly, the laugh of someone who has spent 60 years loving you and is finally watching you surprise them. "Get in your car," she said. I drove to Tucson. 12 hours, with one overnight stop at a motel in Albuquerque, where the woman at the front desk complimented my boots, and I told her the story of Raymond picking out my coat, and she said her husband would have done the same, and we both stood there in the lobby missing them together for a minute. I arrived at Ruth's on Christmas morning. She had the coffee on and a real tree in the corner, and her neighbor Frances came over mid-morning with a fruitcake and a gift for me wrapped in silver paper. Inside was a journal with a deep blue cover. Frances, who had never met me before that morning, had written on the first page in pencil, "For the woman who's just getting started." I don't know how she knew to write that, but I kept the journal. My phone rang at 11. My son, "Mom, Merry Christmas," he said. He sounded uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was young. "Merry Christmas," I said. A pause. "We got a note this morning," he said slowly. "From the property manager. About the house." It said he stopped. "It said the house is owned by a Dorothy Calloway." "Mom, is that—" "Yes," I said. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear Ruth in the kitchen humming to the radio. "Dad's trust?" he asked finally. "His father's trust," I said. "Left to me. I found out a few days ago." Another pause. Longer. "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the poinsettia on the porch, about the phone call where he'd told me space was limited, about Vanessa's voice when she said, "We adore you," while meaning something else entirely. "I didn't know myself until recently," I said, "and I suppose I wanted to understand what things looked like without it first." He didn't respond to that. I wasn't sure he understood what I meant. Maybe he would, eventually. "We should talk when we get back," he said. "Can we come see you? Properly." You can call me when you're home, I said, and we'll see. I said it gently, not with anger, not with performance, just with the plainness of someone who has finally run out of room for anything that isn't true. Ruth and I spent 4 days doing exactly what we wanted. We drove to the desert on the second morning and walked until our legs told us to stop, then sat on a flat rock and ate the sandwiches she'd packed and didn't say much, because sometimes the best conversation is just the sound of wind through brush and the knowledge that the person beside you has known you longer than most of your memories. We watched old films in the evenings. We made tamales from a recipe her neighbor shared, badly, with much flour on the counter and much laughter about the flour. We went to a late service at her church on the 27th and sat in the back pew, and I felt something settle in me the way a stone settles at the bottom of clear water. One afternoon, I walked into a small gallery on the main street and stood for a long time in front of a painting of a woman at a table, alone, with a cup of coffee and a window full of morning light. She didn't look lonely. She looked inhabited, like she had arrived somewhere. The artist was an older woman, in her 70s, who had started painting after her retirement. She told me this when I asked, standing with her arms crossed loosely, like someone comfortable in their own skin. I spent 40 years teaching, she said. I thought that was my story. Turns out it was just the preamble. I bought the painting. I had to rearrange my suitcase considerably to fit it. On the drive home, I thought about the lakeshore property. I thought about what Raymond had written. This is for you, not for them. I thought about the women I knew, and the women I didn't know, who had spent decades folding themselves into spaces that were never quite the right shape, who had swallowed their own voices to keep the peace, to keep the family, to keep being needed in rooms where they were not really seen. By the time I crossed back into Ohio, I knew what I wanted to do with the property. Paul Whitmore was mildly surprised when I called him with the proposal. Not opposed, just surprised, the way good lawyers are when their clients make decisions based on something other than profit. I wanted to convert one of the retail units into a community space, a resource center, for women over 50 who were navigating transitions, job loss, widowhood, estrangement, retirement, the particular kind of loneliness that comes from outliving the roles that used to define you. Legal consultations, financial workshops, a lending library, a room where you could just come and sit with other people and not have to explain yourself. I had a name for it already. I'd been turning it over since Albuquerque. The table, because that was where things happened. That was where Raymond and I had talked everything through. Where I'd sat with my son's homework and my own grief and my cups of tea and my unanswered questions. The table was where you came back to, where you were still yourself. Paul said he knew a contractor. He knew a nonprofit consultant. He said Raymond had once mentioned, years ago, that I'd have something good to do with the place when the time came. He knew you'd figure it out, Paul said. I thought about Raymond in his study with his careful handwriting, sealing that envelope, and trusting me to open it when I was ready. He knew me better than I knew myself, I said. Sometimes the people who love us do, said Paul. My son came to see me in February, without Vanessa. He stood on the porch and looked older than I remembered, which was strange because I saw him at Thanksgiving and he hadn't looked old then. But something about him standing on my porch with his hands in his coat pockets made him look like what he was. A man who had done something he couldn't quite undo. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He tried to apologize in the way people apologize when they're not entirely sure what they're apologizing for. He said things about the pressure of the holidays and Vanessa having a hard year and not thinking clearly and meaning to call more. I listened. When he finished, I wrapped my hands around my mug and looked at him. I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. The anger had moved through me like weather and left the air clean behind it. But I need you to understand something. I am not available to be someone's afterthought. Not yours, not Vanessa's, not anyone's. I love you. That hasn't changed. But who I am and what I'm worth, that was never up for your family to determine. He looked at the table. I know, he said quietly. I think I've known for a while. Then know it differently now. I said. Know it in the way you act. He nodded. He drank his coffee. After a while, he asked about the table, because Paul had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to someone who had mentioned it to him, the way things travel in small cities. I told him about it. I watched his face as I talked. He listened the way he used to listen when he was young, with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak. Dad would have loved this, he said. He did love it, I said. He just had to wait for me to find it. The table opened in April. It was a Tuesday, which felt right. Not a weekend with fanfare, but a regular day when regular women could walk in off the street and find something waiting for them. Ruth flew in. Francis sent a card. Paul brought his wife, who turned out to be a retired social worker with an opinion about everything, which I found immediately charming. The artist from Tucson sent a small painting for the wall, a different one, blues and greens, a window with morning coming through it. We had 43 women through the door that first week. One of them was 71, recently widowed, who had never opened a bank account in her own name. We helped her open one. She cried. I didn't, but only barely. One was 54 and had spent 26 years in a marriage that told her daily that she was too much, and upon leaving had no idea who she was outside of that verdict. She came in on a Thursday and sat for an hour and said almost nothing. She came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. One was 68, recently retired from 30 years in hospital administration, who walked in with the slightly shell-shocked look of someone who has just realized that the structure they mistook for identity has been removed. She became our first volunteer coordinator within 3 months. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound useful. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what happens when a woman stops asking for permission to take up space. It turns out there's an enormous amount she's been holding back. It's September now. The maples in my backyard are thinking about turning gold again. I've started raking earlier this year because I have somewhere to be afterward most days. The table runs on a schedule that would have seemed impossible to me 2 years ago, a version of me who thought the shape of her life had already been set. My son calls every Sunday. We're careful with each other, the way people are after something has shifted and they're still learning the new terrain. It's not the warmth I'd hoped for at Christmas, but it's honest, and I've decided I prefer honest. Vanessa sent a card in July. It was brief and formal, and I could tell it cost her something to write, which meant it cost her something to mean. I wrote back. Short, warm enough. Ruth is coming for Thanksgiving. We are cooking together and not inviting anyone we don't actually want there. I've started painting. Badly. But the woman from the gallery in Tucson gave me the name of a class, and I go on Wednesday mornings, and I am the worst student there, and I love it absolutely. Raymond's letter is framed now, on the wall of my study. Not the whole letter, just the last line. Don't let anyone make you small. I look at it when I need to remember. I look at it when I forget. I spent a long time believing that the life ahead of me would only be a quieter version of what had already passed, that my purpose had been poured into other people, and what remained was just the container, the empty space where the useful things used to be. But here is what no one tells you, or maybe no one told me, or maybe I wasn't ready to hear it until now. There is a version of yourself that was never for anyone else. Not for your husband, not for your children, not for the roles that organized your days for 40 years. She was always there, underneath all of it, patient, the way a river is patient, beneath winter ice. She doesn't ask for much. Just the chance to move. I am 64 years old, and I have never felt more like the beginning of something. And I am not done yet. Not even close.